Hey, Tim Frisch with the Frisch Perspective here. Today I wanted to continue to look at the conversation between Dr. MacArthur and Dr. Chou as they discuss the upcoming revision of the New American Standard Bible, which they're calling the Legacy Standard Bible, which is going to be produced by scholars from Master's Seminary and College. And it will be a legacy both of the New American Standard Bible, but also of Dr. John MacArthur's ministry. It's a fascinating conversation. I took a look at it recently on another video and just gave some of my initial feedback on the conversation. But I want to continue with that today, talking about my reaction to what they're saying here. And like with many things that I see from Dr. MacArthur, there are things that I definitely see where he's coming from and agree with. But there are some things that I think, we need to make sure we keep things balanced in how we look at it as well. And so the thing that I really want to bring out today and focus on is a term that I see in this conversation used several times as they talk about updating Bible translations and how some translations are updated quite often. And we do see that in recent years, translations that are being updated continually. MacArthur uses the term, and then Dr. Chou also uses the term chasing the culture. I can let you see some clips here to see how they talk about this.
The trend these days is to update everything, to retranslate. Translation comes out 5 or 10 years later, they want to update it, they want to do it again, they want to catch up to the language. They chase the culture a little bit, chase the changes in vernacular. Because the Bible never changes, if you have an accurate translation of the Bible, it doesn't need to change, it doesn't need to be updated. It doesn't need to accommodate the culture. What happens in the culture doesn't affect the eternal Word of God. Is it fair to say that you don't need to sustain a translation for 250 years because you can make small adjustments in the words, but neither do you need to continually update a Bible and chase the changes in vernacular? Where's the balance in that?
It goes back to the inerrancy of Scripture. And the principle is we want to always go and uphold what will accurately communicate what is inerrant. That is the original text. That is the autographs. And in light of that, we don't want to chase the culture, because chasing the culture means that the culture now has priority over the inerrancy of Scripture. And we don't want to freeze something unnecessarily, because that may lead to misconception about what the inerrant word is saying. And that principle of always just going back to, we want this word in all of its precision to be clear, not adapted to a culture, but to be clarified to the culture, over the culture. That, I think, is what needs to be critical in all this. In the art of translation, what we're after is not trying to appeal or appease or chase after the culture. We're trying to get translation deeper into the inerrant word. Anything we can do to make it more accurate, more consistent, more precise, that's what we want to aim for, as opposed to the other way around.
So we're not asking the culture for anything, for any contribution to our translation.
No.
We are sensitive of the language. We are sensitive of not using, say, thee or thou, because you can use you, but we're not asking the culture to help us translate.
So when they talk about chasing the culture, I do see what they're trying to say and where they're coming from. The idea that as our culture changes and as our language changes, one of the reasons we see so many updates of Bible translations is to try to keep up with the changing culture. Now, I mentioned this before, that our culture is changing rapidly. And so I think that that's adding into this issue of Bible translation update. And it is an important question and a difficult question. How often do translations need to be updated? But there's something here that I want to point out to try to round out this particular issue. And I'm not sure I would always characterize updates as chasing the culture, and that's an important point that I want to bring out here. I know this is how they're framing the idea of updating, and I understand where they're coming from. And I think that concept is actually catching on. I heard someone use that term. Translations are chasing the culture. So while I understand where they're coming from, this is the very concern that I have, is that the Legacy Standard Bible is going to be used by some people in a superioristic way, that they're going to look at other translations. For example, with this terminology here, they might look at other translations and say those translations are chasing the culture. But here are some things that I think are important to consider. And first is that language itself is part of culture. And so as they're discussing this idea of chasing the culture, we do need to recognize that language is part of culture in and of itself. So just by having an English translation, in some sense, you are adapting to culture. Because if you really want to just totally be in the culture of the biblical authors, then you need to read their languages. You need to see it in the way that they expressed it in the original, and you need to know their language. But we're English people, and so we need to recognize that just by having a translation, in some way you are adapting to culture. But, with that culture of language, and we're in English speaking in my context, language itself changes. And I think even with the Legacy Standard Bible, you can see that they are adapting to certain current changes in culture, and they do acknowledge this. They do acknowledge in their discussion that there's a certain amount of change that is acceptable when it comes to updating language in Bible translation, because language does change. So if you think about the original New American Standard Bible, going back to the 60s and 70s, in reference to God, like in the Psalms, it would use these and thous. And then the update of the New American Standard Bible in 1995 did away with that. So that was a language change, and that had to do with shifts in our culture, really, that we no longer use references to God with words like thee and thou. So the New American Standard made that change, and I think from what I'm hearing them say that the Legacy Standard Bible is going to maintain that change that was made in the 90s. So there's a recognition there that, language does change. And language, as I said, is part of culture. Another way we could see this is in the area of gender usage. And that's a very sensitive issue. I've talked about that before. And that's where people tend to react strongly, is how do you translate gender language? But I think it's important to be fair and point out that how we deal with gender language has always been something that has been an issue and has changed depending on the context. And you can even see this in the New American Standard Bible from 1977 to 1995. I'll give you a couple examples here where you can see how they decided to change the gender language a little bit. So in Romans chapter 2, verse 6, in the 1995 New American Standard Bible, it says, "Who will render to each person according to his deeds." But if you go to the 1977 edition of the New American Standard Bible, it says, "Who will render to every man according to his deeds." So there's an example where before in 77 it said he will render to each man, and then that was changed in 95 to person. Another example would be 2 Corinthians 8:12, which says, "For if the readiness is present, it is acceptable according to what a person has." And that's in the 95 version of the New American Standard Bible. In the 77 version, it said, "For if the readiness is present, it is acceptable according to what a man has." So you can see in these two instances, they went from the idea of man, using the word man, to using the word person. Now, I will say that from what I can tell, in that last instance, you can see that those were italicized words. So they're not changing anything from the original language here. These are instances where maybe the Greek wasn't even using the word man, but in the 77 version, they tried to put that in English and they put it in a masculine sense. Probably was carried over from the American Standard Version. So it's not an issue of changing anything from the original language from what I can see here, but it is a difference of expression. That in 1977, it was more acceptable. It seemed to make more sense to say, render to each man according to his deeds. But by the 95 update, they felt it needed to say every person according to his deeds. Those are just subtle differences, but you can see some of the changes there in those examples. And so, this is nothing new. And even in a very, I would call it a non-pandering translation, the New American Standard Bible seeks to be very literal and is, to my way of looking at it, not a gender-inclusive Bible in any way. And yet even in that 95 update, they, in those instances, moved a little bit further away from masculine language. Again, not because they were changing anything from the original language, but just how are we going to render this to English speakers today? And using the word man in those instances no longer seemed appropriate or the best way to translate it. So you can see what I'm talking about here, I think, in these examples. So I guess what I'm saying in this is, while we do want to be careful that we're not, as they say, chasing the culture, constantly trying to adapt everything to what our culture values and says, at the same time, we shouldn't necessarily think of all updates, even if they're somewhat regular, as necessarily chasing the culture. We don't have to think of every update as chasing the culture. And one example that I would say would be the English Standard Version. That has been updated at various times. So for example, in, I think 2011, 2016. But I really don't think that, even though those updates were fairly close together, that the English Standard Version Committee was seeking to chase the culture. I just really don't believe that. So I point this out so that people don't necessarily automatically assume or get into their heads that if there is a translation that is updated, that therefore that translation is chasing the culture. Now, you all know, I think, if you've listened to me, that I'm not a big fan of updating Bible translations all the time. I don't think we need to do that. So, there's a sense in which I'm actually more on the side of the Legacy Standard Bible, that I like the idea of keeping a Bible translation pretty much the same for a long time. However, I do think there are other reasons than chasing the culture, to put it that way, for updating a Bible translation. So, for example, just trying to make sure that we're as accurate as possible. Maybe there's a word that, as they've gotten more information, as they've dug up more manuscripts or compared more manuscripts or done more studies on that word, they feel there's a better way to render that word in English. And that would be one reason to update a translation that is not in any way chasing the culture. It's actually seeking to do what MacArthur and Chou are talking about, which is to be more accurate to the intent of the authors. So, there are other reasons to update, and some translations seek to update more regularly, and I think that sometimes they can have good reasons for doing that. But I understand the point that they're making in this conversation about how meaning does change if we allow our culture to ultimately dictate certain translation choices. I do believe that. I think that the words that you use to translate matter. And I do think that because our culture is where it's at, it is shaping the way we translate. But I will say this, that's nothing new. I believe, for example, that the King James Version was shaped by the culture of the 1600s. I think there's no doubt about that. So there's a sense in which we can overstate this. And I think that might be part of my concern here, is that they're making it sound as if you can have a translation that's not in any way shaped by the culture that you're in. And so that's an important point here, that all translations are affected by the culture in which they are produced. even the Legacy Standard Bible, right? I think we have to acknowledge that the Legacy Standard Bible is being produced in a certain culture. First of all, it's being produced in the American culture, but even more narrowly speaking, it's being produced by the culture of Master's Seminary, Master's College, and some of their cultural realities and the setting that they're in. So you can't get away from it, that every translation is in some sense a product of its own culture, the culture of the translators and the setting in which it is produced. But I understand what they're saying here, right? That, we can allow our culture to ultimately change the meaning of what the original authors intended. And that's something we do need to be careful about. So there's a balance in this. And I just wanted to give you some of my thoughts on this. And I hope it's been helpful and interesting to you. But I would love to hear what you think. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. And as always, thank you for listening to what I have to say from a fresh perspective.